Hi guys, welcome to the video lecture on intercultural communication, which is chapter 3 in your textbook. So everyone belongs to multiple cultures or identities, and each of these cultural identities are part of our individual identity. In turn, identities contribute to our understanding of culture, so it's kind of a cycle. And navigating various cultures and identities is key to effective communication, especially if you're talking with someone from a different cultural background or several different cultural backgrounds. So let's stop for a second just to kind of illustrate this and make a list of all the cultures to which you belong. These might include those related to your nationality, race, ethnicity, sex, gender, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, age or generation, disability or ability, certain interests and hobbies you might have, or career. And choose 3 of these and list one way that the culture affects your understanding of yourself or others. For example, how might you express emotions differently as a woman, man, or a non-binary individual than someone of a different group? Or how might you view morality differently based on your religious affiliation? How are the expected norms of dating and relationships affected by your sexual orientation? Do you have any beliefs, rituals, values, or practices influenced by your race or ethnicity? What are they? You don't have to write these down. This isn't homework, but I would like you to pause for like a minute or two and just think about that before we move on. And for the sake of not like having a bunch of dead air, I'm not going to pause for that minute, so just do it on your end. So you probably behave differently with a date than with your parents, or with a grandparent than with a best friend, or at a religious institution than without, when you're out with a group of friends. And this has to do with behaving according to the expectation of the culture in which you're interacting at that moment. So what is culture? Culture is the system of shared values, beliefs, attitudes, and norms that guide what is considered appropriate among an identifiable group of people. So we all have individual ideas for right or wrong, but if we were to expand those to a group, and that group was to agree on certain things that were appropriate or inappropriate, or certain priorities, then, and all of them were to basically be on the same page about that, and they all had some identifiable characteristic in common, then that would make them a culture. And values are at the heart of any culture. Values are the commonly accepted standards pertaining to morality and behavior within that culture, and cultural values are transmitted and modified through communication. So we conform to those values through our communication. We show our support of them. We also show where we might not agree with them, or where we might need to change them through communication as well. So there are 2 real types of values for every culture, and these probably apply on the personal level as well. There are ideal values. These are values that members profess to hold, or standards that they live up to. It's what they think is right in the best of situations, what perfect might be. Real values often differ, though. These are the values that guide actual behavior, and they often are different from ideal values. These might be the values that you hold, when you're in your own home and you can't live up to the ideal values, because none of us are perfect, right? Intercultural communication is defined as interactions between different groups with values different enough to affect behavior. Culture shock is the discomfort experience from being in a new cultural situation. And there are a million examples of this. Probably the most common is you go into a new country and they don't speak the same language, and they eat different food, and there are communication rules that are different. That's a pretty extreme example of culture shock, but it can also occur on a more local level. Let's say that you belong to one religious group, but your friend belongs to another, and you go to their church, and you kind of feel out of place because you don't really know their beliefs as well as you know your own. That would also be culture shock as well. So what are some types of cultures? The first 2 are in the book, but I added a couple others because I think they're important as well. So the dominant culture is the learned system of norms held by the majority group of empowered people in a society. So this is the people who make the laws and who enforce the laws. The dominant culture is what they consider to be the values that they hold as appropriate and maybe right or wrong. A co-culture is a second culture which exists in addition to the dominant culture that is comprised of a smaller group of people with common values, beliefs, attitudes, and customs that are different than the dominant culture. And at the risk of bringing in race into this, in America, I think most people would agree that white individuals, particularly middle class to upper class white males, are the dominant culture, and minorities are a group of different co-cultures that exist alongside. And you might have different cultural values in each of those minority groups. You know, some African Americans may have a different cultural value, set of cultural values than the dominant white culture. If I'm wrong on that, please let me know. It's just what I've seemed to have observed over years of looking at it. So just let me know. But that might be one example. Subculture, which isn't in the book, is a smaller group within a culture or a co-culture that has mostly similar values and beliefs as the main culture, but might differ in some aspects. So you might say, define yourself as Christian, but a denomination within Christianity, a Methodist or Baptist, that would be a subculture within the Christian culture. Counterculture is also not in the book. It's a cultural group that appears to espouse or even contradict a different set of values than the dominant culture. So you have your dominant culture is, mostly upper middle class whites who prioritize organization and maybe are WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And then you might have your goths, your teenage goths, or your emos. They would be a counterculture that is trying to react to the main dominant culture. Code switching is what we call changing linguistic or nonverbal patterns to conform to a different culture. It's used most commonly when referencing language. If I speak English, but then I start talking in French, I code switch. It also occurs at other levels as well. So something many of you might be familiar with is how you write or speak in an English paper, and then you maybe go and you text to your friends, and it might as well be a different language because text speak is a different language. So when you're switching from that informal text speak to that formal English, that's a form of code switching. Academically, it often involves cultural shifts. So a commonly used example is that a speaker of African American vernacular English might use a different form of English at home than at school. That's perfectly fine. That happens a lot. A friend of mine grew up in an Italian household, and when he would go to school, he had been to an English-speaking school, and so he had to switch back and forth between English and Italian at home and at school. So that would be another example of code switching, from an academic perspective. Sometimes it is a way of indicating who is in part or included in a group. So teenagers often use slang to differentiate themselves from their parents' generation, and they code switch between the teenage language and the adult language as a way of indicating that they are in a different group, in a different culture. This has to do with language being an indicator of culture, cultures having their own vocabularies and their own ways of communicating. But code switching is really just about switching your behavior or your language to fit the needs of the culture that you're in at that moment. Cultural identity says that part of our self-concept is based on how closely we associate with dominant co-cultures, subcultures, and countercultures. So in other words, our identity is in part defined by the cultures to which we belong. We're going to stop here before we start going through the groups of American co-cultures.